All right. What is going on, friends? We have finally gotten internet out here in the middle of nowhere, which means I can go back to making some long form content. Some of the most popular long form content I've done on my channel has been these exercise accessory tier lists where I go through all of the exercises you guys requested to have ranked and kind of give you my general thoughts on why I would rate different accessories highly. As usual, we're going to attach some caveats. One, we are talking about the strict overhead press today. This is not a jerk. This is not a push jerk. This is not a push press. This is not overhead for strongman where we are allowed to use our legs because that might skew our accessory selection and what is good training economy and what isn't quite a bit. And then the other caveat that I would feel bad not to attach is that we're not assessing the absolute efficacy and direct carryover of the exercise. If we were just saying direct carryover, everything in the S tier would be the things that look like an overhead press, and everything in the D tier would be things that look further away. We're not just looking for direct carryover here. We're looking for how well they fill the role that they would be supposed to fill in a well-written program. Do they do the things that we're expecting them to do? Not necessarily what is going to, if you add 10 pounds of this, what's going to add 10 pounds to your overhead press? Because like I said, specificity would absolutely ruin that thought experiment. Today, Kirsten is going to be joining me as she did for the bench accessory tier list, a true pressing enthusiast, professional intermediate lifter, and she's going to weigh in on any of the ones she has strong feelings about. Kirsten is an avid enjoyer of bench pressing, maybe a little bit less of an enjoyer of overhead pressing, but an upper body bro nonetheless. So we're going to get in. I think we'll just start picking right off the bat here. Machine rear delt fly. What would you give this?
For overhead press?
Yep, overhead press accessory.
I'm gonna go B. I feel like shoulder health is important, and I don't know if that's gonna be a fallacy, but I'm gonna go with B tier.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable take. If you guys follow the channel at all, you will know that I like including rear delt training anytime I'm doing any overhead work. Even if it's not just the rear delts, we're also training the rear traps, maybe even the lower traps a little bit, all of which are very important muscles for stabilizing our overhead press, because it's not just about outputting force with your front delt. We also have to meaningfully control and stabilize that weight overhead and drive it back as we come up during the lift, as well as the fact that I do find including some rear delt work anytime you train your front delts does lead to the shoulders feeling a little bit better, being able to recover and handle a little bit more volume. So while we don't have rigorous studies on this, on like the ideas behind structural symmetry and you got to do 1-to-1, I'm not telling you guys a ratio, but I will tell you that on average, most people's shoulders feel much better with some rear delt work included within their program. And I think a machine rear delt fly gets that job done quite well. I would be tempted to even move this up to A tier because it's a simple way to run up rear delt volume. But I think that it doesn't maybe offer, we're going to put a bunch of quotations around the word functional. It doesn't offer maybe some of the functional benefits of training, stabilizing musculature through a greater range of motion that some of the other rear delt and upper back exercises we're going to get to might offer. So the next one that we are going to rank is going to be the seated overhead press with no back support. What would you rank this?
I feel like it's gotta be S tier or A tier. I feel like it's probably harder to lean back. It might be able to do a little less on it. Probably better practice of technique, etc.
Yeah, so I would probably be split between putting this exercise in the S tier and the A tier. I think that it is really helpful for learning the overhead press, how to overhead press a difficult rep without a layback pattern. So it's a great motor patterning issue. If you're someone who knows you have that tendency to always lean back, the second a rep gets hard, this takes away that capability. It's very challenging on the midsection. So whatever kind of midsection strength you'd be looking for within an overhead press, this is going to build up quite well. And it's a self-limiting variation, which means that let's say you're overhead pressing 1 or 2 days a week, week and you want to add in a third one, but you're not quite sure if you can recover it, you can use a self-limiting variation to allow yourself to fit in that kind of, let's say it's 2.5 or 1.5 frequency. I am going to put this at, I'm going to put it A tier. I feel pretty comfortable with that assessment. I think that a lot of the time, what people need is not necessarily self-limiting variations. They need to put on muscle mass to the relevant primary movers, because just like the bench, the strict overhead press seems to be uniquely dependent on how much muscle we have in the primary movers. It's maybe a little bit less skillful than something like a squat or a deadlift, and maybe a little bit less neurally demanding because the absolute loads are lighter. And really just having big primary movers is the name of the game. And how you build up those big primary movers, how you get in that volume, isn't always the most important thing in the world. Similarly, we're going to rank the Z press next. A very similar exercise to the no back support seated overhead press. Where would you put the Z press?
I would put it in S tier, having done Z press for blocks many times.
Yeah, so
it sucks, but it helps.
So this is one that's a very controversial one. Some people have come out against it and said, I don't really understand the purpose of this exercise. Other people have said that it's the bread and butter. It's the holy grail of building up a big overhead press. Most of the things that have been said about the no back support seated overhead press, in that it's a self-limiting variation that challenges the core, keeps you really true to the vertical pressing pattern. All of that can be said and then some with the Z press. And I actually mean that as a slight critique of the motion. I think it maybe is a bit too self-limiting. And I think most people would be better off going a little bit heavier and doing the seated no back support, because they're very similar exercises. That being said, I think there's absolutely a time and a place for that heavily self-limited variation. If you really can't recover from anything heavy and you want to get in a little bit more of that motor patterning, a little bit more hypertrophy work, the Z press can be your friend. And if you have any struggles with midsection strength, all you need to do is get better at the Z press, as it's a very specific challenge to the core when it comes to overhead press. But I would put it just below the seated no back support overhead press in the A tier. That's where I would probably toss that. The next one is a dumbbell lat pullover. What do you think, Kirsten?
I don't like these. I think that there's a lot better ways to accomplish what you want to accomplish with this exercise, and I feel like if you're looking for like hypertrophy, this seems harder to progressively overload, and yeah, it just seems a little silly. So I think I'd put it in D tier.
Okay, so Kirsten would put that in D tier. And as a antagonistic motion, I would tend to agree, right? Like sometimes if we train a vertical press, oftentimes we like to pair it with a vertical pull, because many people find that developing the antagonistic musculature leads to a greater feeling of stability. It feels like they can output the force from the primary movers better. Lots of people find benefit from that. So as far as this being an antagonistic motion, so we did some front delts, we got to do some lats, I would say this is pretty poor. The one benefit that it does offer is that it can help people who have tight lats achieve a better overhead position. And I can tell you that most people have tight lats and a pretty shitty overhead position. So this can be a form of like loaded or active mobility, and can be done prior to the overhead press to help you achieve that better bar back over the center of your foot position. And because of that, I wouldn't say it's useless. That bumps it straight out of the D tier. I think it can have a solid place in a program if the person specifically struggles with their overhead position. Maybe they could do these, or they could do some dead hangs, or we could do IYT raises. Where are we ranking these, Kirsten?
I'm biased because I'm really bad at them, but that probably means I should be doing them. So I think I'm going to put these in B tier. I don't know if they should be below or above rear delt flies, but
bada bing, bada boom, straight to S tier.
Oh my gosh.
These are the gold standard of building a good overhead position, good overhead stability, because we're doing the raises in a wide variety of, also, don't use too much weight on these. If you are throwing up 20s and 25s, you're probably doing them wrong, or you are a strong motherfucker, one or the other. I use about 10s nowadays, and that's taken me a little bit of progress, and really controlling them in those upper ranges of motion. It's going to build up your front delt. It's going to build up your lateral delt. It is going to build up your rear delt, your upper traps, your mid traps, and even to some degree your low traps. all pivotal parts of achieving and stabilizing a heavy overhead press. I think that they are a good two birds, one stone exercise in that they attack that upper back. They attack that mobility of the overhead position. So we're going to be able to stabilize those big weights. Once we have that front delt strength to drive it out of the bottom position, they're going to allow us to transition into a good smooth press. And they double as hypertrophy for the shoulders. And filling up your shoulder hypertrophy volume and getting big old shoulders is going to be a pivotal part of getting a big old strict press. Because like I mentioned earlier, overhead press is very similar to the bench in that it's muscle mass dependent. And on some level, our training might look a little bit more bodybuilding-esque if a big strict press is our goal. And I think that a IYT raise is a wonderful middle ground between that bodybuilding delt volume, but also something that's very position specific and is going to make you a more skillful overhead presser as well. Let's see. Next, we're going to do lateral raises. What do you think?
From what I understand, a lot of what you get out of lateral raises is bigger shoulders. So I think of it more as a bodybuilding exercise rather than a strength building exercise. So that would mean I would put it pretty low. I don't know. I don't want to put it in D tier, but I may. I think I will.
Okay. I think that the benefits of the lateral raise, right? A, we're training our shoulders. A bigger shoulder is going to help with a bigger overhead press on some level. We're kind of relinquishing some of those benefits we just talked about. We said, oh, the IYT raise is a great bodybuilding exercise that also offers like some movement skill and movement quality benefits. This is just a bodybuilding exercise for the most part. One thing that's good about them is people complain. They're like, oh, every time I do a lateral raise, I feel my traps a bunch. Why is that? What the heck? This is bullshit. I want to feel my lateral delt. Well, if we're training for bodybuilding, that might be a problem because that's not the muscle we're trying to have be the limiting factor, and it's not the muscle that we're trying to target. But in the overhead press, the traps are quite important. The scapula needs to rotate upward to get into an overhead position. So if we're training the traps as well, awesome. Two birds, one stone. Also, anytime we're kind of moving the shoulder girdle against resistance, we're training our rotator cuffs. So this myth that they're completely unfunctional, I would say is a little bit oversimplified. They're solid shoulder volume, and if you like them, doing them will probably set you up for some extra future success in the overhead press. That being said, it's maybe not the best use of our bodybuilding slots, but if you love them, you want big cap delts, it's not as though they're not going to benefit you. So I would probably put these right behind the rear delt flies. I would pick rear delt flies over these, as I would always kind of favor, if I've done my vertical pressing, I would rather make sure I go get in my rear delts. Lateral delts, if they happen, they happen. If they don't, they don't. Whereas I wouldn't leave an overhead session without at least hitting my rear delts a little bit. Now the next one, what do you think? A regular bench press, so like a moderate to wide grip.
Ooh. I know for people, I would say a lot of people overhead can carry over to bench. That's from a powerlifting perspective. I don't know. I think it depends on how you bench, probably. If you bench with a close grip.
No, this is assuming the grip is kind of wide.
Oh, assuming wide grip? Ooh, I don't know. C.
Okay, I think that's a very reasonable take. With a wider grip, we're prioritizing the chest a little bit more. The chest is fairly irrelevant to a strict overhead press. I mean, to some degree, we are recruiting the upper chest to drive it off the chest. But again, this isn't maybe the best use of training economy because it's just inferior to a closer grip bench or a medium grip bench. So we'll define it mid to close grip is just the better option here because we're taxing the triceps and the shoulders more, which are just the more relevant musculature. We do get some of the benefits that we would be getting from a close grip, which is we're challenging our shoulder stability with weights far heavier than what we can overhead press. There's some distinct benefits there. If we're able to bench big weights, more than likely we have the tricep power to lock out a overhead press. That's assuming our stability and mobility is on point. The tricep strength will be there if you have a big flat press. That's something that is nice about training the bench press alongside the strict press is if you're doing good on the bench, you got the triceps. Then it's just a matter of getting A, the delt power, and B, that kind of overhead stability and mobility to do it well. And that's kind of the three pieces we look to put together. But the flat bench with a wider grip just does that in an inferior way. I would probably put this at the bottom of the B tier just because it is a heavy pressing motion done strict. It's not like it's not going to help at all.
You're too
But
nice.
then we're going to go to its big brother, the Alpha Chad close to medium-ish grip bench. Where would you put this, Kirsten?
The only issue I have with putting this super high up is that it's another big compound motion, and I would worry you'd be taking training economy away from more overhead pressing, which would be more specific if your main goal is bigger overhead press.
So that is a phenomenal point, right? And that's where we can kind of use exercise ordering to kind of save our ass.
So if we do that second and maybe with less weight.
If our overhead press is our priority, we always begin with the thing that's the higher priority. So if we begin every upper session with our vertical press, that would indicate that it's our higher priority. We do as much vertical pressing in each session that we find to be beneficial, then move on to the close grip, knowing, okay, our results on the close grip bench are going to be worsened by the fact that we did the overhead first, but that way we know that we're not pre-fatiguing ourselves and worsening our results on the more relevant motions. So no, this shouldn't replace more vertical pressing, right? The best way to get better at vertical pressing is to vertical press, but as a supplemental motion to expose the triceps and shoulders to
A tier.
Oh, we're going straight to S tier. I really do believe that a close grip bench is a absolutely stellar motion that should be in just about any program focused on developing your strict overhead press. Usually I have people do their bench presses with whatever grip their overhead is, but that's not a hard and fast rule. I just find that exposure of the triceps to additional load kind of checks off the triceps, as I mentioned. Then it's not a question. If we have that big close grip bench, the reason we missed the overhead was not because of our triceps. It was because of our stability, our mobility, or just general shoulder power. So it's a very nice peace of mind exercise and just kind of checks off a box that we then don't have to worry about quite as much. And it's very much a part of any program that I would write.
Yeah, I feel like if you've ever done close grip bench and overhead in the same session, you can tell that it's working the same muscles.
Yeah,
the one you do second is going to be tired.
Yeah, whereas people will say, oh, I don't see carryover back and forth between my strict overhead press and my bench if they bench with let's say a bigger arch or a wider grip, and it's a little bit more reliant on their chest. Those of us who bench with closer grips can definitely see the effects of both ways, either a overhead press to a bench or a bench to overhead press, assuming we are using a closer grip on both of these options. The next one we're going to do is a loo raise. A loo raise is the one where you do a lateral raise, but all the way to an overhead position.
I've never actually done these, but I saw Sam doing them the other day, so I'm going to assume that puts them higher up. I'm going to put them a high B tier.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assessment. I'll probably just toss these in bottom of A tier. Some people are at a point in their training where they can't necessarily do these all that well. But just because some people are not prepared to do an exercise doesn't mean it's a bad exercise. And it doesn't mean it's off the table for life. I would say from a bodybuilding perspective, if our goal is hypertrophy of the lateral delts, these are inferior to the lateral raise because that 90-degree position all the way to the overhead position is more trap than it is lateral delt, and it's just limiting the weight we can use. But that being said, we flip it around and we say, okay, but this is more of an overhead stability exercise, and it's just as much for the upper back as it is for the delts. Then we could make the same kind of point we did, which is, hey, maybe filling our bodybuilding volume with something like this or the IYT raises is going to yield us close to as much like shoulder hypertrophy as the lateral raise or the rear delt fly, but also give us that benefits of improving our overhead mobility, improving our overhead stability. So I think it's a very good use of time within a training program if it doesn't bother your shoulders at all. I rate them reasonably highly. The next one would be a JM press. A JM press is halfway between a skull crusher and a close grip bench, kind of folding to the collarbone.
I don't know. I'd put them smack dab in the middle. I don't think they're a bad exercise.
Yeah, I gotta say, I'm split between top of B, bottom of A. And the only reason they're not comfortably tossed in the A tier is for a lot of people, they're not at a point in their training where they've developed their triceps and their tricep tendons enough to handle a heavy folding press without pissing off their elbow. It is something that you can progress towards. And if this is something you're interested in, you can look around and listen to Mr. Bald Omni Man himself. He had a big issue where he couldn't do any supplemental tricep volume after his pressing work because it would light up his elbows. And he said, okay, I've come to the conclusion as a long arm bencher, benching just is more than enough tricep work. I can't handle much on top of that. But then down the line, he started doing some banded tricep press downs, which had a therapeutic effect on his elbows. It developed the tolerance, and then suddenly he's able to do tricep rope press downs. And then suddenly he's able to do straight bar skull crushers and French presses, which is about as invasive on the elbows as you can get. So just because not everybody is prepared to do this exercise doesn't mean that not everybody could get to this exercise, but it's dropped down because it's not viable to throw in your program right now for everybody. So I think we will go tippity top of B tier. But I do think they're a phenomenal exercise. Now, here is one. This is supposed to indicate to us wide grip overhead press. What do you think?
That is so weird. I have no idea. C tier.
Yeah, I think we're gonna go C or bottom of D. The big issue with this motion, on paper, it's a good way to challenge the shoulders more. And if you're like, okay, well, my triceps are strong and my front delts are lagging, a wider grip should be a good way to challenge that. The only issue is that most people will pick up little injuries doing these. The reason you're favoring that closer grip is because you lack the stability for a wider grip oftentimes, and forcing it wider often leads to problems.
Oh, sorry. Would you do banded overhead instead in that situation?
Well, banded overhead press, I would say, is more to prioritize
the top of the
the top of the movement and the triceps. I would say that if our goal is what we would be looking to do with a wider grip overhead press, which is to challenge the shoulders a little bit more, I would maybe a wider grip can work, but we would do it in a little bit more stable and safer of a setting than a free overhead press. So maybe we go to do a Smith machine press and we take a slightly wider grip, or we get on just like a seated overhead machine, right? It might be okay to take a wider grip than you would ever take on a bar on that seated overhead press machine, because that's where that external stability can be quite helpful. It can let you press from an angle that would feel pretty dicey to move any substantial weight in a free plane, which actually brings us to our next one. I'm going to toss that C tier. Again, it can't be that useless because it's a barbell overhead press. It's going to carry over to your other barbell overhead presses. I don't think I could put it in D tier. But I don't like it. That would be my assessment. I don't think it's something that I would throw out there because I just think that maybe the risks outweigh the rewards. And you guys could probably catch me on this one and say, hey, Sam, I thought no exercise was inherently injurious. I thought it was just load management. Well, I struggle to load manage this exercise, so we're putting it bottom of C tier. Now, speaking of external stability maybe being beneficial, right here we have this very muscular guy, looks just like me, doing a seated behind the neck Smith press. Where would you put this?
I say behind the neck press is the highest test overhead press you can do, and I want to put it in S tier just because it's fun.
Okay, yeah, so I really like behind the neck press as a variation to, like we talked about earlier, our goal is, hey, we've got pretty good overhead stability, good mobility, our triceps are good. We really need to address that raw shoulder power out of the bottom. I find behind the neck presses do that really well. Where a lot of people run into issues on the behind the neck press is their inability to stabilize weights heavy enough to be really helpful. And that's where the Smith machine comes in handy, where we're fixing that plane. We can really develop some pretty brutal shoulder power on these. But I have to be logically consistent here and say, because I said the JM press is not always the best option because not everybody is ready for it. So I can't just say, throw this shit in your program like I could with an IYT raise or a close grip bench. I have to say that there's a lot of people who are not ready for this. In the past, the behind the neck position has been demonized, while for some people with their anthropometry, that might not be an option. For most people, it's something that can be progressed to and then be safe. It's only dangerous when people jump straight into it. They don't have the mobility. They don't have anything, any strength in that range of motion, and they try to go heavy in that position, and then lo and behold, it hurts. They go on the internet and say, this exercise is terrible, never do that, destroyed my shoulder. Well, no, you being a jackass and having terrible load management is what hurts your shoulder. Going and telling other people this exercise is inherently bad is kind of crazy. That being said, not everybody's ready for it. It is absolutely, if I were to pick one, my favorite overhead press accessory for myself, but we're going to remove my personal biases and put that at the top of A tier instead of putting it in S tier as my soul wants to. The next one. Now, here's a pretty obscure one for you. This is called a Bradford press. You take it in the front rack position, you press it, don't lock out, and go to behind the neck and then back and forth over your head.
I've seen people do that. It seems like a good idea at face value. My only concern is how limiting that kind of motion would be in terms of building strength or muscle. So, but it's also like you could say, oh, you're getting the benefits of both in front of you and behind you press. I don't know. I might put it at bottom of B tier.
I think that is a perfect placement. I would tend to agree with those concerns. It's kind of hard to program and beat the book on this exercise. It gets really dicey. So it's not something that most people would take to a close proximity to failure. So maybe it's not the best muscle building tool, but I will tell you that every time I go to overhead press, I warm up with some Bradford presses. I find it to be a very good way to warm up not only my front delts, but my upper back musculature. And when I'm able to do a couple of empty bar Bradford presses, when I then start warming up on a regular overhead press, my ability to drive the bar back into a good overhead press position is phenomenal. So I think this is one of those exercises where no, we're not pushing this really heavy, but the inclusion of it in a program, especially in a warm-up setting, can be super helpful. So I wouldn't say it's like our steak and potatoes, this is what's going to get us big and strong type exercise, but I also would not be comfortable saying it's useless by any means at all. Yeah, I'll put them bottom of B, even though I do them all the time, just because they're not a real builder. They're more of a movement screen than anything else. It's okay, I'll start putting heavy stuff over my head once I can comfortably do some Bradford presses with the overbar, and that's kind of my gatekeeper to stop me from going up too early. Now the next one, this is free weight, but we're going to say it's either a Smith machine or free weight. High incline press, so far higher than we would do for chest. We're basically choosing the highest incline where we can get our chin out of the way and touch it to our collarbone. Where would you put this?
This seems similar to me to a close grip bench type motion. I'm tempted to put it in S tier. It is a little bit closer to an overhead, so I don't know how well it would pair with overhead pressing in the same session. Maybe if you're limited by your back or some sort of like something that has to do with a standing overhead press, you could do this on like a secondary day. But that's kind of a weird one for me. I might put it in A tier though, still.
I think we're going to S.
Okay.
I think your knee-jerk reaction was pretty good. I think that A, this is one of the absolute best exercises for developing strength out of the bottom position, because we're not, like you said, we're not limited by balance. We're not limited by our core. We're not limited by our stability even, really. We're able to press some really heavy weights in a roughly vertical plane. We get to expose our front delts and our triceps in much more relevant positions, down in that deep stretch, just like the bottom of an overhead press. And it's going to be one of our go-to tools for just developing really good power out of the bottom. I've always really liked the combination of, on one day, my supplemental motion might be a high incline press and the other day might be a behind the neck press. And every time I've ever run a scheme like that, my press has built monstrously strong out of the bottom and in the mid-range, thanks to the behind the neck press. And then as long as I've been doing my homework and I've been doing my upper back exercises and keeping my upper and rear and mid trap strong with my IYT raises, and then I've been doing my close grip benches, I can lock it out too, because I've got that tricep power comboed with that upper back strength. So that's kind of a lot of that is my approach to, if someone told me strict press is my only goal, assuming they're able to do them, we'd be looking at a lot of strict pressing. We would be looking at doing supplemental work via the Smith machine behind the neck press and either a free weight or a Smith machine high incline press as our supplemental shoulder work. Then we'd probably be looking at maybe doing some close grip work and then ending each session with maybe some IYTs, some Lou raises, some rear delt work. And that would be a lot of the basis of how I would build up an overhead press. We're going to have to pause the video in a moment here because it appears some of our exercises have not loaded. But before we pause and resume, the standing, we're going to say this is internal and external rotations on the cable, just the standard old physical therapy exercise. Where would you put it? What do you think?
I think they're a good warm-up exercise. I feel like similar to, what was that called? Was it called Bradford?
Bradford presses?
Yeah. I don't know. I would put it similar to that, except I still feel like it's less of a strength exercise, but I think it's probably important. It's like doing face pulls or something for your rotator cuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I think some direct training of our rotator cuffs can be helpful. I think that the myth emerged where if you don't do this, you're going to hurt them isn't necessarily true. Our rotator cuffs are going to get quite strong and resilient just from doing pushing and pulling and lateral raises and a wide variety of planes of movement. If we're wow, we're managing our loads well, we're going to have strength all over the place in our rotator cuffs. It's only for people who maybe have a little bit of a past history of rotator cuff injuries where the inclusion of these becomes, it's a nice little silver bullet to just like, okay, I've got whatever strength I built up from stabilizing everything else I did plus a little bit. And that's kind of that prehab, rehab, bulletproofing type thing, where if you know that's an issue you're prone to, it's absolutely a good addition to the program. I'll just toss these in the bottom of B tier just because lots of people fall into that camp. So it can absolutely and frequently will find its way into a well-written overhead program. Okay, we are back. We put together so many exercises for this that they all wouldn't load in on the first one. And to go add them in, Kirsten warned me. She told me to take a picture of it. I forgot what I put in what tier, so if it just changed on your screen where things are ranked, I stand by where they were before the shift. This was just me trying to guess off of memory where I had put them. But picking up where we left off. Next, we are going to look at the barbell, easy curl bar, maybe even a dumbbell French press, the standing behind the head extension.
All right, I know not everyone can do these right away. I know they hurt some people's elbows, but I really like these. I get an insane pump in the long head of my tricep, and that makes me feel like they're doing a lot for me, even if that, I don't know if Sam's going to say that's true or not, but I'm going to put them in A tier.
Yeah, so I think that, again, these are a little invasive on the elbow, and we have a theme here of maybe moving something down if they're not accessible to everybody. But I think I'm going to put these in S tier, to be honest. There's a lot of research out there now that training a muscle at a greater average length makes it grow more. And the way to put the long head of the tricep at its greatest average length is to put your arm over your head. So, these are great pound for pound tricep builder. They're a great accessory motion that is going to challenge our overhead mobility to some degree. They're going to challenge the mobility of your lats to get the elbow overhead. Muscle strength is position specific. So you could argue that these are building maybe tricep strength that's slightly more relevant to an overhead press because maybe in that shortened position we build up all this strength in a press down. Yes, it's going to have some correlation to overhead, but this is very directly linked to overhead because it is overhead. So I'll just put these bottom of S tier. I would understand if you bumped them down due to being an invasive motion on the elbow, and I would not blame you, but they are an amazing tricep builder for any pressing motion, but especially the overhead due to their just slightly higher specificity. Now the next one, here's a weird one for you. Where are we putting shrugs?
I feel like there's no way this is a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Building your traps, it's going to help with handling all that weight up there. I don't know. I feel like B.
Yeah, I'm stuck between, let's say, the bottom of B tier and the top of C tier because the idea is there. Developed upper traps help you achieve a good overhead position. But there are exercises you could be doing to build up that overhead position that actually involve being overhead. So, yeah, it's not the best exercise for that slot, but that doesn't mean it won't get the job done. I think we're going to go middle of C tier. There's an idea there, and it's not a bad idea. But even an overhead shrug on a barbell would be a better selection for that idea. Something like a Lou raise and something like an IYT raise is going to yield the kind of trap development we're really looking for, while also being a little bit more relevant in a lot of ways. Now, the next one we're going to look at, log press. What do you think?
Well, it's just a harder overhead press. So I don't really know. I think maybe A or B. It's probably, I feel like I would say it's unnecessary if your goal is a strict barbell.
Yeah, but you have to
overhead
remember
press.
this is an accessory to your strict overhead.
Yeah, so I would say that this has an injury risk that may be a little bit unnecessary for your goals if you want barbell overhead strength.
I am a massive log press enjoyer. This is a shit accessory for your overhead press. A, you're being limited by a clean now. B, you're getting a bunch of lower back fatigue. C, the big diameter of the log is making you take a more leaned back overhead position. It just doesn't make sense as an accessory. That's not to say that, if you do log press, your overhead press isn't going to go up at all. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm telling you, if you're writing a program and you're like, you know what variation I think is going to blow up my overhead press? Doing a log. No, wrong. Bad idea. We're going to go middle of C tier. I can't put it in the D tier because it's putting something heavy over your head. It's hard. It'll help you put other difficult, heavy objects over your head. Now, if you are so inclined, what about a Swiss bar?
This is like less bad log.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just going to put it in the top of C tier.
So yeah, whatever thought process you had with the log, the Swiss bar is going to be better. You're going to be able to easily take it out of a rack, save yourself the clean, which just doesn't make sense from an overhead development perspective. You're going to be able to get a greater range of motion. And whatever you were looking for by shifting to a neutral grip, maybe tucking the elbows in a little closer, whatever strength you were looking to build up, the Swiss bar is going to be a much more practical way to do that. It is a great variation. It's very hard, and it can be a solid staple for some people. It does come with its own drawbacks. Stabilizing this shit is hard. To the point that it might be a little bit too self-limiting for something that isn't really helping the overhead. It's challenging your wrist stability. And B, because of the thickness of the bar, it forces you back into a little bit more of a leaned back position than most people are going to want to be, and introduces a little bit more low back fatigue from the overhead press than people are going to want to see. But it does offer a lot of positives. So I think we're just going to toss this in the middle of B tier. I feel reasonable with that assessment. The next one is going to be a pull down. What do you think?
I think it's a great exercise. I'm tempted to put it in the S tier.
I think you'd be right if you put it in the S tier, because I'm putting that shit in the S tier. It makes a lot of sense. It's not going to directly build up your overhead press, but lots of people have found that when they're trying to develop their pressing strength, doing a motion in the antagonistic plane is very helpful for them. A vertical press is supplemented by a vertical pull, and a lat pull down is a vertical pull that we have great control of our hand position as well as the load, right? Which brings us to our next one, which is the pull-up. Very similar to the pull down. But we have maybe a little bit less precise control over the load. Lots of people would say, it's a closed chain motion. It's more functional. You're going to need to present me with some evidence I haven't seen to support that. That being said, they are a great motion. They are an antagonistic lift. That can absolutely help your overhead press in the same ways the lat pull down can. I usually favor towards the lat pull down just because of precision in control of the load, just letting you fill that role of hypertrophy a little bit better. But the pull up absolutely does a damn good job, and I would be remiss not to put this anywhere lower than the top of A tier alongside my beloved behind the neck Smith presses. Now this is a one I got asked about. Front squat. Quick.
Quick? Okay. Surprised it's not D tier. I think it's C tier. I think it helps build a lot of core stability, upper back, something about your upper back, probably. They'll put it in C tier.
Yeah, so if we were talking about for strongman or for weightlifting, where we are using our legs and putting even heavier weight overhead, I might even put this in the S tier. We're exposing ourselves to really heavy weight in that front rack position. We're building up the upper back, as you mentioned. We're building up those quads, which are a primary mover of a push press. But then when we're talking about a strict press, on the other hand, our quads are not the limiting factor, or if they are, you're not doing a strict press. And oftentimes, it's not even our midsection that's the limiting factor. It's truly shoulder strength. So they drop down in priority a ton. That being said, you get some peripheral nice little benefits out of these, where if you happen to be front squatting on the side, cool, you have some extra upper back strength that'll always be there to help you out. You've got a surplus of core strength. You probably won't have to do much additional core work for your overhead press if you've been front squatting and Z pressing. You really don't need to go do some low scale core exercises, but it's going to be bottom of C tier, because if we're just talking about it as things we can do that are likely to yield big returns to your standing overhead, I'll move it up to the top of C, because if we're getting really strong on the overhead, it does become a real task to stabilize that weight, and that mid-back and core strength can come in handy. It's just not the first thing I would throw out there as a solution to somebody's plateau. Now the next one, behind the neck girlfriend presses.
especially if she's a big old lady like me, I think that's probably an S tier exercise.
I think it's D tier.
No! Why?
The range of motion, that was way too easy. The range of motion was tiny because you were up on my shoulders. That's a quarter press.
Okay, and then you add injury risk.
May as well be doing some
girlfriend and you.
May as well be doing some 4-board benches and claiming you bench 500. It's
but
a bunch of mumbo jumbo.
S for fun.
S for fun. F tier for fun. Ab wheel. What do you think?
I got no idea. I put that in. I mean, it's not unhelpful. Like it's same as front squat, right? You want some of that midsection strength, and it's what do you call it when you stay in the same spot?
Isometric. Yep.
Yeah, it's isometric. I don't know. I put it in C tier.
Yeah, we'll toss it kind of middle of C tier. If we're doing these other big compound exercises, especially for an overhead press, especially if we're front squatting or Z pressing, just doing more of those will build up whatever level of core strength you needed. If you're not doing those and you feel better doing them, I can see them fitting into an intelligent program, but I would not put them as a necessity by any means. The next one we're going to look at would just be like a shoulder press machine.
I put that pretty high. I put that in A tier.
I think I would put that, I want to say like right below the Swiss bar press.
Well, I could see why it would be worse than a dumbbell overhead, but really below Swiss bar?
Well, I think the Swiss bar can be good because it forces you to kind of keep your elbows in and build that strength of like shoulder flexion rather than relying on flaring them out, and it can kind of force you to tuck your elbows and build up some strengths that people have a hard time building. The overhead press machine, most of them, the bottom position isn't necessarily the best. The strength curve might not be the best, but they're a great way to just hypertrophy relevant primary movers. I would always pick my behind the neck Smith presses, my no back support seated overheads, my high incline presses over this for that kind of just general front power development and size development. But they can fill that role just fine if that's what your gym has. Just getting real strong in that 8 to 15 range on these is going to build up the big shoulders you're going to need to have a big overhead press. They just wouldn't be my first choice. Now here is one that is kind of interesting and divisive. A regular incline bench, like roughly 45 degrees.
Less good than high incline, but I don't think bad. I think if you do it with a normal person grip, I would put it probably in A tier.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very reasonable placing. I'm going to kick the Z press down to B tier and replace it with the incline press because lots of the benefits we would be gaining from that moderate grip bench press, we could also be gained from an incline press in that we're exposing our front delts and our triceps to stabilizing more weight than we're able to press overhead. I think there's a good argument to be made that this could move its way up into S tier and compete with the close grip bench for that role of, okay, well, it's a little heavier close grip press to expose our triceps and our delts to stabilizing big loads. I think that argument could be made. I just think that enough people have shoulder issues when performing a narrow to medium grip incline that I usually just favor doing a flat press instead. But if you can, these are a phenomenal accessory. Now the next one, Paris's favorite, trademark upright rows.
I think this could be part of building big shoulders to have a big overhead press. Saying they're Paris's favorite makes me put them higher than I would have initially. I'd go high B tier.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a reasonable take, right? In our hierarchy of let's call it bodybuilding work for the shoulders. Maybe they're not the king like a Lou raise or IYT raise of function and hypertrophy, but they're also they're certainly no worse than a lateral raise. I would say they're pretty comparable. The only thing that would put it below the lateral raise is just the fact that almost anyone can go train some lateral raises and not run into pain. There are plenty of people who either due to their anthropometry or just due to the fact that they haven't progressed their way into the exercise gradually are not able to just go start hammering them like they would maybe a lateral raise. So that higher barrier to entry, I might put them slightly below the lateral. Next one, seated dumbbell overhead press. Now,
S tier.
Now, here's the big caveat that Kirsten and I are going to attach for you guys. It depends on the execution. If you're flaring the elbows out, right, and you're going kind of mid-ear level, as most people do them, I actually see very little carryover to the overhead press.
You're wrong if you're doing them that way,
And
unless you're a bodybuilder.
I think that they end up just being a worse version of a behind-the-neck Smith press. But on the other hand, other side of the coin is if we're rotating those dumbbells to more of a neutral position at the bottom and getting that deep range of motion that looks more like our overhead press, suddenly these become a lot more relevant. We are going to be rating them assuming you're rotating the dumbbells. So you said S tier. What do you stand by that?
I stand by that. When I do them, I rotate them 45 and I touch my shoulder with the edge of the dumbbell. That's how much ROM I'm getting, and I feel like they're super helpful. S tier.
Yeah, I definitely. Honestly, I'll probably put these beating out the no back support seated overhead. I think that it's one of those ones that's a little hit or miss. I personally don't get great returns out of these, but I've also coached enough people that have gotten insane returns out of them to know that they're a good exercise. And just because they're not the bomb for me doesn't mean they're not a phenomenal exercise. Honestly, if I had a bigger sample size, I could see these working their way up into the S tier alongside that high incline press as a very similar motion. And also, one thing that we benefit from doing these, let's say, seated dumbbells or let's say high incline dumbbells rotated with this big range of motion is, yes, we're developing that shoulder hypertrophy. Yes, we're developing that raw shoulder power to drive a heavy weight up from the bottom position, but we're also challenging our stability more, which the same can't be said for the Smith machine accessories. So maybe we'll even go above the behind the neck and put my own personal biases aside. I don't know. Overhead yoke carries. You haven't done these, so I will just rank these myself. They're not useless. They're an okay way to build up some good core strength, some good overhead stability, but I think it's a very inefficient way of doing it.
And a little overkill, probably.
That's exactly what I was thinking, right? It's like we could have built a good overhead position by just doing some dead hangs, doing our overhead presses well, and then doing our IYT raises. We don't need to fatigue ourselves with some over our max overhead carry. I think when we're talking about an overhead press with leg drive, where we're having to use our legs and put a weight that we couldn't strict press over our head and catch it, then maybe this could have a bigger place. But in a strict press, honestly, really not a great use of time. I would kind of put this right behind the log press because at least with the log press, you're pressing it. Next one, power raise.
Considering these are in my program written by Sam right now, I'm going to assume they're pretty high. I don't know, A tier. They're not my favorite rear delt exercise, but they've been helpful.
I honestly would put these at the bottom at S. Kind of my holy trinity, or my big four for that overhead stability plus hypertrophy slot would be like IYT raises, Powell raises, face pulls, and Lou raises maybe. Lou raises are kind of hit or miss, but those other ones would be my big three. Speaking of, because I mentioned it, I spilled the bag already. I also love face pulls, both because they help you develop all that upper back and rear delt musculature associated with a great overhead position, and they also are a two birds, one stone exercise where we're getting the benefits that we were looking for in that prehab rehab setting of including the external rotation. So great two bird, one stone exercise. Most programs I write that are overhead centric will have face pulls in them at some point.
Or any program you write, probably.
Yeah, most of them do.
I've been doing face pulls since my first day I ever went to the gym.
Now, push press.
I don't think it's very relevant for overhead press.
Yeah, when we're lifting raw, the assumption is that the deepest range of motion is the most difficult range of motion for the most part. We can use a stretch reflex and you can compromise your position, but generally speaking, mechanically, the bottom of the squat is the hardest position, the bottom of the bench press is the hardest position, the start position of the deadlift is the hardest position, and then much the same, the bottom of the overhead press is the hardest position. So this argument of using our legs to supplement the hard part and then overloading the easy part just for the purpose of building up a strict press, not really my cup of tea. I would say that it probably outperforms the log press and the overhead carry for sure.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think it's useless. And there are people who are very good overhead athletes who swear it has had some carryover to their strict press.
Oh, I
I
was
just
thinking of push jerk. Push press makes
Oh,
sense.
yeah,
Sorry.
push jerk
Yeah.
would probably be below the log.
Yeah, I thought it would be push jerk would be D.
And that brings us to, if our goal is to overload our tricep and shoulder strength in the upper end positions, the banded overhead press. Take a
I
guess.
would put these probably in S tier.
Bada bing, bada boom, you're right.
Yeah, I don't know. I think since we did a whole block of just banded, that makes more sense in terms of like, because I raised concerns before about exercises and where you would slot them, but we just did banded instead in the place of regular overhead press, and it was very humbling, but I think it was very helpful also.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like, we can look at this a couple ways. If our goal is overhead press with leg drive, where we probably need the most strict strength up at the top where our legs are no longer assisting us, banded overhead press is a great accessory. And on the other side of the coin, it's still pretty heavy in the bottom position. So we're still working on our strict strength out of the bottom. Whereas a push press, we're not developing much pure shoulder strength out of the bottom. Whereas because we're doing the banded press strict, it's not like we're missing it, right? And we don't go crazy heavy with the bands and look for the heaviest top weight possible. It's just light bands to make it slightly different and challenge the triceps and the overhead position a little bit more. It's a great variation that's very close to what we're getting better at, that shifts the muscular emphasis. So there's perfect transference in technique. It's very similar, so we're going to get great strength carryover, because anytime you do something really similar to something, it's going to carry over well. And it's just a simple way to shift the muscular emphasis a little bit in the way that a push press might be looking to, but better. This video has gotten quite long, so I'm going to power ranking speed through these last ones. Dip, I'm going to put in the A tier. I think that they can kind of serve that function that a close grip does, which is if you're good at these and the tricep power is good. I just find that lots of the people I know that love dips love them because they do them shittily and they cheat them, and they've got a big ego because they can dip 3 plates, but they're doing it very poorly. Whereas I think there's some level of forced honesty to the incline and the close grip bench options of tricep building, to where I would usually favor those. I think a lot of people are inflating their dip numbers. Not to say dips are a bad exercise. I just see a lot of ego lifting on that one. Overhead pin press. Just starting, assuming you set the pins to wherever your sticking point is or right below it. These are a great one. Put them in bottom of A tier. Again, it looks like an overhead press. It's strict. It's likely to help, especially if we're selecting good pin heights. It's really good. I think these can be a great close variation. I always have preferred the bands over it, but some great athletes really like the pin presses, so we could probably move this way up past the seated no back support, maybe past the pull-up because it's a little bit more relevant. Let's see. Deficit handstand push-ups. Super cool exercise.
D.
Yeah, super cool exercise, and often feels really good on people's shoulders. The problem is there is no scaling to this thing at all. At least with a pull-up, we can assist the pull-up with a band, or we can make it harder with weight. And so, like, yeah, it's a little bit more difficult to have precise load control and hit our exact volume parameters on a pull-up, and that's kind of a little inconvenient. This thing is impossible. If you hang weights, it's going to be hitting you in the face. Really just not the best, in my opinion. We're going to go bottom of C. It's not useless, but there's just the horrible load control kind of removes it in my book. Single arm standing overhead press kind of challenges your core in a unique way, can help you build up your core. It's almost like a Z press in spirit, where we're challenging our stability, but on the sides of our body. It's a good way to run up some extra volume. It's pretty heavily self-limiting. I think it'll be outperformed by a lot of other options. But it's still challenging the stability of both the shoulder and your core, which can often help the overhead press maybe more than a machine would. I think that it's outperformed by the double dumbbells, assuming you're rotating them all day, but it's not useless. Bottom up kettlebell press can be a helpful gatekeeper exercise, kind of like the Bradford press, where, yeah, that's not going to be building much for you, but being able to do a couple reps of those before your overhead press can kind of be a unique challenge for the rotator cuffs, and it can be a good gatekeeper. We're just going to arbitrarily toss this in the middle of C. And then a Turkish get-up is training so many different motor qualities that are never going to be the limiting factor in a strict press. I feel comfortable being putting this below the girlfriend press.
Dang.
Probably even less helpful on a minute-to-minute basis. So that is our tier list. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you all.